Good morning. Thanks for coming, y'all. Has anybody ever heard of an oyster farm? Yeah, all right. Does anybody like to eat oysters? So I may be a little biased. I wish. I may be a little biased, but personally I think farm-raised oysters are the best, and I can tell you why. So for those of you that don't know, farm-raised oysters start in a hatchery where we actually take adult oysters and use them to produce the baby oysters that we call seed. So once those seed are large enough, we can actually move them out into the natural waters, into bags like these. So you see these bags have tiny holes, that way we can hold the baby oysters. So these bags will get hung on a line out in the beautiful waters here, and they will actually feed on natural phytoplankton or algae in the water. So it's very low maintenance. As they grow larger and larger and larger, we will move them into larger mesh bags. So these bags have bigger holes in them. That way we can get more water flow through there and deliver more food to those oysters. And so these farmers will have long lines strung out in the water with tons of these bags hung on them. And that's how they grow farm-raised oysters that they can harvest for y'all to consume. So in the process of doing all this farming stuff, a lot of people have a negative outlook on aquaculture. When they hear aquaculture, they think salmon and how the salmon can escape from the cages and infect wild populations. Well, today I kind of wanted to tell you why oyster farming is good in comparison to other types of aquaculture. So, like I said, we put these guys out in the water and they are feeding on the natural algae out there. And in doing so, they filter a ton of water. One adult oyster can filter up to 50 gallons a day, which is a lot of water. And so in doing so, they are constantly removing particles from the water. Even if it's not algae, they remove it. And they will spit it out as what we call pseudofeces, or false poop, basically. And that will actually clump together all those little particles and help them settle out of the water faster. So by doing that, it actually improves the clarity of the water. And that allows for more light to penetrate down to the bottom, and we actually see that seagrasses will grow around oyster farms, which is good. We want those algae in the water. Not only are we growing oysters, we also grow little critters in these bags. So these critters can be anything from crabs to fish. We have shrimp, mussels, all kinds of stuff that end up climbing into our bags when they're really, really little, and then they eat on all the stuff that grows on our bags, and they grow large. And then as a farmer goes through and culls their oysters, they release these guys back into the environment. So we actually create hot spots in water where there would have been nothing growing to begin with. And when these guys recruit into our bags, they attract the larger fish. So if you're a fisherman and you find an oyster farm, if you fish around it, you're going to catch some good stuff. There's lots of mullet. We get red drum. We actually see a lot of sheep's head because they like to eat the barnacles that grow on our gear. So that's another benefit of oyster farming, is that habitat provisioning. Another good thing about oyster farming is that it will, as the oysters filter, they actually pull excess nutrients out of the water. So you hear a lot about rivers dumping a lot of nutrients into the water, things like nitrogen and phosphorus. These guys will actually filter that out of the water and help improve water quality in itself. So that's another benefit of oysters. Oysters will also use carbon to build their shells. So they grow their shells as they get larger, and in doing so, they actually take carbon out of the water, which is a good thing. If you hear about global warming and how we have excess carbon in our atmosphere, oysters can be a sink for that. And then, once those oysters are ready to eat, obviously we enjoy them a lot. Once we are done enjoying them, what actually happens to the shell? Do y'all know? Anybody know? Have you ever seen shell recycling programs? So the restaurants in Mobile and in other cities all along the coast, they will actually recycle their shells. So they collect them from the restaurants. They allow them to age out in the sun in order to kill off anything that's growing on them. And then they can actually dump those oyster shells back into the water, which provides a new layer of shell on the bottom to attract wild oysters to come back. So a lot of times this is used to rebuild wild reefs that have actually gone downhill. Basically, you can't harvest anything from them. So we can put those back into the water and kind of help the environment. They can also be used to build living shorelines. I don't know if you've heard about those, but basically oyster shells are hard, they're tough, and you can use them to kind of enhance a shoreline and prevent erosion, so prevent wave action from eroding away sediment. So that's another use of oyster shells. They can actually be ground up, and they're high in nutrients, so they can actually be added into chicken feed. So a lot of chicken feed mills will use ground up oyster shell in their feed in order to enhance the digestion of that chicken. They can also be used as a fertilizer for soil. So if you grind them up and put them in your soil, they will slowly release the nitrogen and phosphorus that they have put into their shell. And they can also be used for construction projects. A lot of people will actually use ground up shell in place of sand and concrete, which can kind of help eliminate people taking sand out of the environment. So those are just some of the good things that oyster aquaculture can provide for the environment. If you want to come up, ask questions, I have lots of different shells that you can touch, feel, and see how beautiful these guys are. Anybody have any questions? So there's been a lot of research done on it because obviously as humans we want to put a value on everything we do. So not only do we want to value how much we sell these oysters for, we want to value the ecosystem services provided by an oyster farm. And some estimates have been in the millions and billions of dollars. They look at everything that an oyster farm can do, from recreational fisheries to improving water quality. So they've estimated it to be in the millions and globally in the billions from shellfish aquaculture. You can. So there's two ways that you can kind of get involved in the oyster world. If you have a pier and access to water, you can become a pier farmer. You can purchase seed from a hatchery and hang that in bags from your pier and grow them up right under there. If you want to get involved in restoration, in Alabama and Mississippi, you can. We have programs called oyster gardening. Now these are oyster larvae that we set onto shell for restoration. So this won't be for you to eat at the end, but if you do have access to a pier, you can receive a batch of baby oysters growing on shell, and you can raise it on your pier. You take care of it, you clean it once a week. Then once they are large enough, the extension system will actually take those shells back, and then they will dump them out on an undisclosed reef. That way they can help rebuild those natural reefs that have gone downhill. So if you do have access to a pier or water, you can get involved in either growing your own oysters or you can do it for restoration purposes. At the Auburn Shellfish Lab, we're in the back corner of the Sea Lab. We focus on anything from doing research for restoration purposes to looking at different farming techniques and comparing those farming techniques and how they produce a beautiful oyster, and then looking at the economic side of it. So how much did it actually cost to produce that pretty oyster? And can a farmer feasibly do all of those things and still make a profit? We also look at the human health side of things. So we research how farmers manipulate their oysters and how that can affect the levels of bacteria in the oysters. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Vibrio bacteria. Nobody? The flesh-eating bacteria of the Gulf? Yeah. So I actually work with Vibrio bacteria. And basically, when a farmer takes their oysters out of the water, they're handling them, they're sorting them, they're putting them into new bags. They are exposing them to warmer air temperatures. It's a lot hotter outside than it is in the water. So when they do that, that oyster actually has an increase in the levels of bacteria within that oyster, but the farmer can fix it easily. So once they're done handling their oysters, they put them back into baskets and they put them back in the water. When they do that, the oyster opens up again, it starts filtering, and it allows those higher levels of bacteria to be purged and go back down to normal. So what I'm looking at is exactly how long that takes for an oyster to purge out all of those extra bacteria and basically return to normal. That way it can be harvested and served to you without any increased risk of Vibrio infection. So actually, I can tell you why a farm-raised oyster would be safer to eat than a wild oyster. So if you think about it, an oysterman who's going out on the reef, he is spending hours out there tonging for oysters. He's actually having to go and look for them. So it's a lot harder for him to harvest within the time temperature window that the public health department has established. And that's basically preventing those oysters from being exposed too long and preventing those increases in bacterial levels. So that oysterman is having to work twice as hard because he's having to go out and find them and get back. In the summertime, they have 1 hour to do this. So they have 1 hour from the time that oyster leaves the water until it has to go into mechanical refrigeration. So like I said, if you're having to search for them, it's a lot harder. Whereas with an oyster farmer, they can actually go out the week before. They will find the oysters that they want to harvest. They will have them pre-counted into bags. So say you have 2 customers that want 100 oysters each. They can basically pre-count out those 100 oysters into each bag, put them back in the water. In Alabama, for the guys using this gear type, it's 7 days. So they go back 1 week later, they pull those oysters out of the water and they haul butt back to the dock. So they can actually get their oysters from the farm to a refrigerated box truck in 15 minutes flat. In Alabama, there's 2 ways that you can start an oyster farm. You can own the land. So if you have waterfront property that has riparian rights, you can farm within those waters. If you are not lucky enough to have a setup like that, you can take my professor, Bill Walton. He holds an oyster farming training class. So once you complete the class, you are eligible to lease a 2-acre plot in our farming parks. And there's 2 in Alabama. There's one in Bayou Sullivan, or Portersville Bay, and one in Grand Bay. So you can lease a 2-acre plot within that farming park. Those areas are marked off. They have to be basically the whole perimeter of the farm has to be labeled with their Coast Guard beacons so that boaters can see them. You can obviously see the pilings and everything. You can see the floating cages once you get out there. But yeah, there's standards basically created by the Coast Guard that say you have to label your farm, that way nobody can run into it. The farms can only be in approved areas for growing, so they can't be in restricted waters where you can't harvest shellfish. But if you're interested, there are ways to get into the industry fairly easily, especially here in Alabama. So here in Alabama, we have super warm waters and a lot of food. So the oysters can go from the hatchery to final grow out and basically taken to market in as little as 12 to 15 months. So it's a pretty quick turnaround time. Just to give you a frame of reference, the Northeast and the Northwest are really big in shellfish aquaculture, but they can sometimes take 3 to 5 years to get their oysters to market. And that's because the water is so cold. Water's cold and they don't have a lot of food compared to us. So that's where southern oyster farmers kind of have that competitive edge, because it doesn't take them as long to grow their oyster. And they do hold up. This is relatively new. Oyster farming started in 2009 here in Alabama. So it's only been about 10 years. Most farmers will split their farm half and half. They'll grow half diploid, half triploid. I don't think I talked about triploid oysters. So if you think about it, we are diploid organisms. We have 2 copies of chromosomes. We have actually figured out how to create a triploid oyster, which has 3 copies of chromosomes, and it will grow faster. It is sterile, so it will not reproduce. So instead of spending energy towards making eggs and sperm, it will actually put all of that energy towards growth. So you can actually get a triploid oyster to grow faster than a diploid oyster. Now with the triploid oyster there are some drawbacks. They aren't as hardy, so they will actually respond worse to bad scenarios in the water, like low dissolved oxygen, or if there's a lot of fresh water. They have basically too much genetic information within the cell. So instead of having 2 copies of chromosomes, there's 3, and that much extra genetic material makes them weaker, and they cannot handle the stress as well. But if you take care of them, they will grow very fast, and you don't have issues in the summer when oysters will get ready to spawn. They get milky and creamy, and they kind of taste weird. I don't know if y'all have ever experienced that. Triploids won't get what we call ripe in the summer, so you can harvest them year-round. So
What the oyster farmers do half and half, just sort of to diversify, because they both have their pros and cons.
exactly. So they're trying to balance the pros and cons. So if you have a low salinity event that happens and you lose your triploids, you still have diploids there that you can still grow and harvest. So we encourage farmers to grow both on their farm. That way they kind of have a backup plan if one fails. I work with Vibrio bacteria. I am trying to balance basically farmers creating best management practices and the human health side of things. So I work between the Shellfish Lab and the FDA lab here on the island. And I talked about it a little bit earlier. When those oysters come out of the water, they get higher bacterial levels in them, and then once they go back in the water, how long does it take for them to return back to normal? And so with my work and a previous graduate student's work at the Shellfish Lab, we actually were able to reduce that, we call it a resubmersion time, so how much time they have to be back in the water. And originally it was 30 days. So if an oyster farmer pulled his oyster out of the water, he had to put it back in the water and not touch it for 30 days before he could sell it.
That was a regulation that was considered sort of a
safe time, yeah. So that was established by the Alabama Department of Public Health. And so we as researchers were like, does it really take 30 days? Because that's a long time to have to wait before you can harvest your oysters. So we actually looked at it again, and actually the FDA looked at it again. And they said, okay, 14 days. It takes 14 days for those Vibrio bacteria to go back down. And we actually looked at it and we're like, okay, 14 days is still a long time, because in 14 days that these oysters are sitting in the water, they can be reinfested with mudworms. That's a big issue for farmers. They actually burrow into the shell. They can also get reinfested with barnacles. Anything that the oyster farmer was trying to prevent by taking them out of the water basically could come back in 14 days. So after we looked at it again, we found that 7 days was okay. And we got a regulation change down to 7 days, but only for half of our farmers, because it only applied to one gear type. So I'm trying to compare the 2 gear types that are being used to see if that 7 days can apply to both farmers. Which basically allows those farmers to move their product to the market faster while still making sure that they're safe for people to consume.
So the 30 days initial regulation.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Thank you all for coming and listening and being good talkers.